President Trump's approval rating has reached the highest point of his presidency. 44% of voting-age Americans say they approve of the job he's doing, while a slight majority of them say they do not.
And for a hint at what's driving his numbers up, look for that one issue for which his numbers are positive. It's his handling of the economy. 51% saying they approve of the way he's dealt with the economy. It's something his rivals have been calling on him to do for weeks, and now Joe Biden has done it in his own way. He
stood in front of an audience in South Carolina, addressed his 1994 crime bill and his earlier comments about working with segregationist senators. Here's CNN's political reporter Arlette Saenz.
Here in South Carolina, Joe Biden offered his most forceful defense yet of his decades-long career in the Senate. He argued that his Democratic opponents in the 2020 race are focusing more on his time in the Senate than they are as vice president. And he also argued that the fact that President Obama selected him as his running mate, he went through the vetting process to get there, that was a testament to Biden's record and character. But Biden also offered a rare apology for his recent comments on working with segregationist senators decades ago. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Was I wrong a few weeks ago to somehow give the impression to people that I was praising those men who I successfully opposed time and again? Well, yes, I was. I regret it. And I'm sorry for any of the pain or misconception they may have caused anybody.
Now, Biden's comments a few weeks ago about working with segregationist senators while he was in the Senate decades ago drew a lot of criticism from his 2020 rivals, including Kamala Harris, who raised it during an exchange at the debate a week and a half ago, and Cory Booker, who said that it was a personally hurtful comment and called on the former vice president to apologize. Booker is now reacting, saying that he is grateful that apology came, though it came just a few weeks after he had initially made that comment. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I felt just grateful that he is now speaking to his past in a way with more candor and with a sense of regret for some of the things that he supported. None of us are perfect. All of us make mistakes, but we need leaders that have the courage to show vulnerability and speak to that, and I'm very grateful.
Biden also talked about his support for the 1994 crime bill and said that he takes responsibility for what went right and what went wrong with that bill. He's faced a lot of criticism from his rivals and other critics who argue that that bill led to an era of mass incarceration. But Biden is going to continue his tour, his two-day tour of South Carolina today. He has events in Charleston as he's trying to court that critical black vote. Black voters make up the majority of the Democratic primary electorate here in the state. And for Biden, he's really focusing in and trying to maintain that support among that key constituency. Arlette Saenz, CNN, Orangeburg, South Carolina.
Joining me now to discuss, CNN political analyst April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks, and author of Under Fire, reporting from the front lines of the Trump White House. Let's start. Well, first, good morning to you.
Good morning, Victor. How are you?
I'm doing well. Early morning in New Orleans, I understand.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
All right, so let's start here with the former vice president and this now apology for what he said about working with segregationist senators several decades ago. Does this settle this for him, or is there still some damage for the 2-week span in which he was trying to explain, to color these comments? What do you make of how he's now handling it?
Well, Victor, people were looking for some kind of correction from the vice president, the former vice president, and he's now done that. It's taken a moment. It's taken weeks, as you said, but at the end of the day, he's apologized. But if there is another issue when it comes to race with this president, that is still lingering in the air, that he said something like this. It is important, however, for us to remember that race is playing a big part. You know, as he's in South Carolina, he needed to say that, or he could have been here in New Orleans for the largest gathering of African Americans annually at the Essence Festival, which he chose not to attend, where about 7 other candidates did, minus Vice President Joe Biden this weekend. But it was important for him to do that. And I guess South Carolina was the backdrop as he is courting the black vote.
He is also backing away from several elements that are in his 1994 crime bill. I mean, Arlette said his support for the bill, he actually wrote that bill 25 years ago. And he says in this speech in South Carolina that he wasn't supporting more money for prisons, but that's what the truth in sentencing clause of that bill did, was offer money to states for prisons. Now, he was against mandatory minimums, but there are plenty of recordings, videos, the congressional record on boasting about minimums for those. How does he reconcile what he's selling now and what we've seen from the vice president during his time in the Senate?
Well, it's a different day. In the 90s, that crime bill, you had people for and against it. Even some members of the CBC were for it. But at the end of the day, in 2019, looking back and lessons learned, Victor, we know that it was detrimental to some communities, particularly the minority community, black communities, and the warehousing of black people in prisons, and the toughness on many people when it came to criminal justice. And you see now, from the Obama administration and now to this administration, efforts to correct wrongs or change how the system has been very hard on people who, when the punishment did not fit the crime. So there are various things that are going on as it relates to trying to fix what happened back then. And it does put a bright spotlight on who he was and what he did back then as it came to criminal justice, and just basically zero tolerance, if you will.
You point out an important element here. The context is important. That's what the vice president has been saying. Several members of the CBC did support the crime bill back in 1994. Right. Black pastors were writing to members of Congress asking for help, and were trying to, in many ways, sell stronger legislation as it relates to crime. Let's talk about someone who did make the trip to New Orleans. You spoke with her just yesterday, interviewed her, I should say. 2020 candidate, Senator from California, Kamala Harris, there at Essence Festival. Now, she spoke yesterday about closing the wealth gap between blacks and whites, and won a way through a $100 billion home ownership plan, closing and down payment assistance for African Americans and other individuals in areas, parts of towns where banks typically discriminated against writing loans, these red lines that were drawn around districts. Let's listen to a bit of what she said yesterday.
Yes.
When our kids want to go to college, whereas other families who own their home and can go into the equity in their home to help pay for their students' tuition, our families have to go, and those students have to take out loans at interest rates that they can't afford to pay off over a long period of time.
She's there at Essence, largest gathering directed at black women specifically. She's spending a lot of time in South Carolina, still trailing, though, in these polls of support among black voters. Is she making progress? What did you learn from your conversation?
Well, it's interesting in this important conversation that I had with Senator Kamala Harris. After we had about 20 minutes, and then after that conversation, she wanted to sit and just talk. She wanted girl talk, if you will, at Essence, that's focused in on black women. We talked about her understanding of her issue in trying to bring the black vote, trying to get those black numbers. And she's keenly aware of where she stands in the black community. But she also likened it to Barack Obama, who was running for president the first time, talking about South Carolina being that pivotal moment for him. And when we talk about South Carolina, as we're talking about South Carolina today, South Carolina was so pivotal because there was a faux pas by then former President Bill Clinton about Jesse Jackson and how he received the black vote there. And then Barack Obama won Iowa, and many black voters ran from the Clintons and went to Barack Obama. And that kind of solidified. So she is looking at who she is today and her standing and where she is. She feels very comfortable, but she also remembers that moment that changed it for Barack Obama, being South Carolina. So we talked. It was a very important conversation, Victor, that we had. And she let us know who she is. And we talked about various things. And she's got a black agenda that she's rolling out. So she's really trying to get the black vote. She talked about housing yesterday, but she's also going to talk in the near future about entrepreneurship, particularly access to capital.
Something that's very important. And we also heard, a plan from Elizabeth Warren talking about diversifying federal contractors. So several candidates, as you said, there at Essence Festival.
Yes.
There. So enjoy the rest of the day, April, there in New Orleans. And
Yes,
thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Victor. Take care.
All right. Happy New Day to you. I'm Victor Blackwell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Dean in for Christy Paul this morning.
We're beginning this morning with explosive memos from the British ambassador to the U.S. describing President Trump as inept, insecure, and incompetent. Sir Kim Durrock, one of Britain's top diplomats, used secret cables and briefing notes to warn the British government that President Trump's career could end in disgrace. Now, these leaked messages were first published by the Daily Mail.
And their headline this morning, The Washington Files. Ambassador's secret cables claim Trump radiates insecurity.
CNN correspondent Anna Stewart is in London covering this story. What more could you tell us about this leak?
Well, as you say, they are absolutely explosive. And these memos date back to 2017 right through to the present day. So they cover a really broad range of topics. As you said, highly damning of the president and the White House at large. I'll bring you one of them just looking at the administration that says, we really don't believe that this administration is going to become substantially more normal, less dysfunctional, less unpredictable, less faction-riven, less diplomatically clumsy and inept. Other memos focus more on policy areas, for instance, policy on Iran, where the ambassador says that the White House's policy on Iran is incoherent, unlikely to improve anytime soon. Questions the president's claim that he called off the missile strike on Iran very last minute. Says that account doesn't stand up. He goes into the alleged links between the president and Russia, going as far to say that the worst cannot be ruled out. And that could see, he says, the presidency crashing and burning. And just to bring you another one, he says that the UK government shouldn't underestimate, though, that the president has great ability to shrug off these controversies, these scandals, saying, quote, Trump may emerge from the flames battered but intact, like Schwarzenegger in the final scenes of The Terminator. So very embarrassing leaks to the British government, who have come out. They have not denied the accuracy of these memos, but they have said that they support their ambassadors on being honest and candid. No news from the White House or from the president yet.
Wow. All right. Anna Stewart, thank you so much. And CNN did reach out to the White House for a statement. The White House had no comment. Well, meantime, President Trump's approval rating has now reached the highest point of his presidency, according to a new Washington Post ABC News poll this morning.
Now, for a hint at what is driving up his numbers, look at the lone issue for which his numbers are positive. That's his handling of the economy. CNN White House reporter Sarah Westwood joins us live now from Bedminster, New Jersey, near the president's resort. I mean, should we call this good news? He's still underwater overall, but I guess better than it has been.
That's right, Victor and Jessica, and good morning. President Trump's approval rating has been underwater for his presidency, but you are seeing those numbers in this new Washington Post ABC poll start to tick up. They've grown 5 points since April, when his approval rating was at 39%. It's now at 44% in this latest poll. And as you mentioned, the biggest factor that's driving those numbers up is voters' perception of how President Trump has been handling the economy. That is the issue on which voters rate him the highest in terms of his handling of that issue. 51% of voters, a slight majority, approve of how President Trump has been handling the economy. His lowest approval rating in terms of how he's handling a specific issue is when it comes to climate change. Just 29% of voters rate President Trump favorably in how he's dealt with climate change policy. Now, keep in mind that this survey was conducted by the Washington Post and ABC News during the period when President Trump was in Japan meeting with world leaders at the G20 summit. He later went on to South Korea. He made that historic visit to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. And yet only 40% of voters in that survey rated his handling of foreign policy favorably. So even though that was the backdrop for this survey, he didn't get as high of marks on foreign policy as he did on the economy. And obviously the White House and Trump's campaign, they are hoping, Victor and Jessica, that the strong economy will continue toward his re-election race next year, next fall.
Sarah Westwood for us in Bedminster. Thank you.
And joining me now to discuss all of this, CNN political commentator Errol Lewis, host of the You Decide podcast and political anchor for Spectrum News. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Jessica.
All right, so we have this new poll out this morning. It shows the president with a 51% approval rating when it comes to his handling of the economy. That's where he's got his best numbers. Yet you also saw that still a slight majority of Americans disapprove of his overall performance. Errol, is his handling of the economy enough for him to get reelected?
Well, I'll put it this way. If there was one category you wanted to be rated favorably in, that would be the one. You know, it's better than foreign policy or national security or almost any other category. So it's part of the Trump brand. It's something that we know voters care about. We know that it's something that will not just energize his base, but also keep some of his borderline opponents, those who really are kind of indifferent to the Trump presidency. Maybe they'll give him a chance, or maybe they stay home. Maybe they don't flip to the Democrats. So, yeah, it's a good position that he's in, and I think they have reason to be happy about it.
And do you think they can convince him to stick to those economic talking points? Because that was an issue in 2018. He had these economic numbers, but went a different way. And the midterms were really much more favorable to the Democrats. Do you think he can stick to that?
That wasn't a mistake. At the end of in the closing weeks of the midterm campaign, he stopped talking about the economy, even though the numbers were actually pretty good and his approval in that area was also pretty good. He moved to immigration because that's what fires up his base. That's what gets them out. That comfort that people have when the economy is doing relatively well for them and their family, it's a two-edged sword, Jessica, because what it means is that many members of his base will say, yeah, things are pretty much okay. I don't have to go out there and, campaign or make phone calls or hold a house party or get too excited about it. And when Trump needs his base out, he goes straight to immigration. He goes straight to divisive issues. Mm-hmm. He goes straight to the kind of things that also really make Democrats upset. So he's got some political choices to make. My guess would be that unless the economy is roaring back, we should expect him to pivot just as he did toward the end of the midterms toward those divisive issues, in particular immigration.
Right. All right. This poll also took a look at President Trump and pairing him against 5 of the 2020 Democratic candidates. If we can show people what that poll showed, you see almost kind of right next to each other, almost a tie in a couple of those races, slight edges. But Joe Biden really standing out there with a 10% lead, 10-point lead on the president there, which is attributed to support from moderates and independents, which, Errol, as we've seen this Democratic primary going left, do you think these numbers show that a more moderate Democrat would be a stronger general election candidate?
I'm not so sure about that. There's this general idea that a quote-unquote moderate, I think at this early stage of the game, it's really somebody that people know. There are a lot of folks who actually don't know the other candidates, and that's why they're campaigning so hard, why they're raising so many millions of dollars, why they're going to be out there trying to, knock heads with each other in the next round of debates and the one after that as well. The fact is, if you just ask people, who do you know, the numbers would look pretty much the same, and Joe Biden sort of far outclasses the rest of the field. I think what you're going to find also, though, is that when you see President Trump attacking the other candidates, he really has a special place for Joe Biden. He doesn't spend a lot of time on the others, on Kamala Harris or even Bernie Sanders. He really goes after Biden because I think they know he poses the greatest threat to them.
Yeah, but to your point, and I want to make sure I'm understanding you, you're making the argument that a lot of this is name ID, that they know Joe Biden, that they feel comfortable with him, that we are still so far out from even, these first primary contests within the Democratic Party, that there's a lot of room there for those numbers to change. Yeah, that's right. And look, there's an open question here. Joe Biden, from the time he released his announcement video, has said we have to remember who we are. It's elections are almost always about the future, but Joe Biden's kind of saying our future lies in going back to a pre-Trump sense of the decorum of the presidency and how things ought to work at the top of the government. That's a tricky argument to make, but he is sort of making it, and he's the only one who can make that argument. He's the only one who has served in the national government. He's the only one who's been vice president. He's making that unique argument. If these polls reflect
people buying into that argument as opposed to simple name recognition, which is what I think it is, then he's well on his way. Then he's got a compelling argument, and if he doesn't get too damaged in the primary process, he may be able to really present a potent challenge.
All right. Well, we have many months to go. I'm sure we'll talk to you many, many more times. Errol Lewis, thanks for being.
President Trump's approval rating has hit the highest point of his presidency so far, but a majority still disapprove of the job he's doing overall. Is there an opening there for a Democratic candidate to exploit, or will a soaring economy continue to bolster the president's support? Joining me now, Brent Podolsky, former Democratic aide and opinion columnist for The Hill, and CNN political commentator Maria Cardona, Democratic strategist. Welcome back to both of you.
Good morning, Victor.
So let's start here. The president has pretty strong approval ratings. Well, when you say strong, he's underwater and has been since he started his campaign, but stronger than they have been. 44% in the latest Washington Post ABC News poll. I want you to listen to this from former Vice President Joe Biden this week when he was asked by Chris Cuomo what it will take to beat President Trump next November.
You think that what's happening with Harris is anything compared to what would happen with you in this president?
No, but everybody knows who this guy is. Come on, man. Come on.
How do you beat him?
I beat him by just pointing out who I am and who he is and what we're for and what he's against.
Who he is, who I am, Maria. Is that enough? I mean, look at the CNN approval rating here. Virtually unchanged over his presidency, now at 43% by CNN's number. Do Democrats have to do more than just say, this is who he is, this is who we are? I mean, he's at the highest of his presidency after family separation and rape allegation and the rest.
Well, I think that Democrats are going to have to fill in what that means. Yes, Joe Biden is going to have to define himself, continue to define himself in terms of who he is, point out who Trump is. People already know that, though. And so he's going to have to fill in what he will do differently than Trump. What does it mean to say, here is who I am versus here is who Trump is? I think there absolutely is an opening, Victor, not just, it doesn't just show in the national approval ratings or frankly disapproval ratings in terms of Trump. But if you look at the states that actually gave Trump the presidency, right, in the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, you have several of the Democratic candidates who are right now beating Trump in those key states. He cannot win the presidency without those states, Victor. And so I think that there's a huge opening with a lot of people who frankly went to the polls and voted for Trump, but didn't really want to, right? They held their nose doing so. There's also a big opening with a lot of people who voted for Trump thinking that he could become more presidential, thinking that he would fight for them. But frankly, all Trump has done is stab them in the back. You have farmers, you have working people where Trump's policies have actually hurt them. If part of Biden's strategy, or frankly any Democrat who gets a nomination, is to point out those ways in which Trump's policies have hurt the people who he promised to help and who voted for him, then I think there's a huge opening there.
So the vice president, Brent, also apologized for his comments about working with segregationist senators several decades ago, and also his opponent for the nomination, Senator Cory Booker, he responded. Let's listen to both there.
Was I wrong a few weeks ago to somehow give the impression to people that I was praising those men who I successfully opposed time and again? Well, yes, I was. I regret it. And I'm sorry for any of the pain or misconception they may have caused anybody.
I'm frustrated that it took so long, but I'm grateful for him doing this. And we should all, I mean, we can't have a culture where we can't have a leader that can't stand up and say, I've been imperfect, I made mistakes, and I apologize. So I'm sorry we had to go through all of this. I'm sorry at one point he tried to shift blame to me, but I'm grateful. I just want to say thank you.
So, Brent, should the vice president have apologized, and does this settle it?
Well, I think it does. I thought it was a non-issue to begin with, to be perfectly honest. Americans want, and Democrats want, a president who will answer and prosecute Donald Trump, not a candidate who will prosecute other Democratic candidates for president. I thought that was a mistake. I think Biden and Kamala Harris are pretty much in agreement on busing. I haven't heard anybody talk about busing in 30 years. And right now, I am wearing a NASA jacket in honor of the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And I think that is something that everyone around the world will stop and think and watch with the same awe that the world watched when they first landed on the moon. Democrats want a president, and Americans want a president who can inspire people to big things and great things and big deeds. Somebody who can do the things that need to be done for the country, for every single American. That's what I think the candidates should aspire to. There's a lawsuit right now by Our Children's Trust, which I have donated to and support. That children have a right not to be killed by climate change caused by government action, working with the pollution profiteers.
And of course, we know that climate change is one of the major issues for Democrats this cycle as well, as is immigration. And I want to get to immigration as well, something that the President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson wrote about in an op-ed in the Washington Post this morning. Let me read this. He writes, "We cannot, as some Democratic candidates for president now propose, publicly embrace a policy to not deport those who enter or remain in this country illegally unless they commit a crime." Okay. Help me understand this. Brenton, let me stay with you. What does that mean? Does that mean support deporting every undocumented person in this country? Or does it mean the opposite, just don't talk about it publicly? How do you receive that?
Well, I think that just as we should help our children not die from climate change in a lawsuit I support, immigrant children, migrant children should not be abused by a president who treats them like they're prisoners of war, locking them in cages. Americans don't want that. The country doesn't want that. Voters don't want that. Democrats ran on that successfully in 2018, that kind of attitude towards immigration. They will do so again. Every Democrat running in this race agrees on climate change, and every Democratic running in this race agrees on not abusing migrant children, and helping the dreamers and giving the kids a fair deal.
Maria, let me bring this question to you, and let's put the quote up again here, because I think the word here is publicly the operative word. He writes, "We cannot, as some Democratic candidates for president now propose, publicly embrace a policy to not deport those who enter or remain in this country illegally unless they commit a crime." How do you receive that? Is it, again, just don't say it publicly?
No, I don't think it's either of the things that you pointed out, Victor. What I think he's talking about is this whole issue of decriminalizing the border, which came up at one of the debates. I actually don't think we should repeal Section 1325, which is where I think the crux of the issue is. I think all the Democratic candidates, and frankly all Democrats and independents and humane people and common sense Republicans would agree that we have to prosecute our immigration laws in a humane way, which is what Trump has not been doing. But the way that you do that is not by decriminalizing the border. It is by actually not separating families and children, right? Trump's policy was the first one who came out, the Trump administration came out with a policy that actually did do just that, separation of children and families. The way that you don't separate children and families is by not separating children and families, right? So if you are a Democratic candidate, that's what you promise to do. You don't have to be for decriminalizing the border, because I think what that does is it gives the Trump administration the talking point that all Democrats are for open borders, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah, and that's what we read in that op-ed from Jay Johnson in the Washington Post. Interesting. He writes it in part as a warning to 2020 candidates.
Absolutely.
Maria Cardona, Brent Badowski, thank you both.
Thank you.
Good morning to you. I'm Victor Blackwell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Dean in for Christy Paul.
We're starting this morning with the arrest of billionaire and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
Epstein is in a New York jail this morning after being arrested on new charges related to sex trafficking crimes committed between 2002 and 2007. He served 13 months in jail after pleading guilty to state charges in Florida. In exchange, more serious federal charges were not brought against him.
Joining us now, CNN chief media correspondent and anchor of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter. Brian, this storyline has been resurrected in the last several months by some good reporting out of South Florida. What we know about what is happening now?
That's right. The Miami Herald broke this story wide open with months of investigative reporting, including on-the-record interviews with some of the accusers of Jeffrey Epstein. That story, that series of stories in the Herald, changed a lot. This is now a federal matter in the Southern District of New York, where we know that Epstein was taken into custody last night. As you mentioned, now in jail, waiting a key Monday morning hearing to determine what will happen next, whether there will be bail, whether he will be allowed to go free while this prosecution progresses. There's already some concern about that. We've already seen some lawmakers come out and say he should not be able to pay bail because then he'll never be caught again. Epstein is a well-connected billionaire, someone who used to be friendly with both Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. So this case has always been seen as an example of two justice systems in America, one for normal people, another for the rich and powerful and connected. Epstein was able to have incredibly lenient terms, what was called the deal of a lifetime, when he first faced these accusations about sex trafficking and predatory behavior toward minors, toward teens. He was able to spend 13 months in jail, but but he was able to go off to an office 6 days of the week and then just go back to jail at night. This was called a miscarriage of justice by the Miami Herald. You see some of the deals here of this non-prosecution agreement. The key there at the end, he avoided a federal trial. And this non-prosecution agreement from many years ago, it came about thanks to the now Labor Secretary, Alexander Acosta. Acosta's role in this has been deeply scrutinized for the past few months, thanks to the Herald's reporting. The Herald's op-ed page has called for him to resign, but so far the Trump administration has stayed supportive of Acosta, although they've said they were looking into this, and Acosta's denied all wrongdoing. The point here is that cases from several years ago, and in most cases here from more than a decade ago, of sex trafficking now being re-examined, and according to our colleagues Shimon Prokupecz and Sonia Mogi, there are new allegations contained in this sealed indictment that'll be addressed tomorrow, Monday morning, in court in New York.
All right, Brian Stelter, more to come on this. Thanks so much. And be sure to catch Brian's show, Reliable Sources, here on CNN at 11 a.m. His guests include Julie Brown, the investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, so they'll be talking more about that Epstein case. Leaked memos from the British ambassador to the U.S. describe President Trump as inept, insecure, and incompetent. Sir Kim Derrick, one of Britain's top diplomats, used secret cables and briefing notes to warn the British government President Trump's career could, quote, end in disgrace. The leaked cables were first published by the Daily Mail.
Look at their headline this morning, The Washington Files. Ambassador's secret cables claim Trump radiates insecurity.
CNN correspondent Anna Stewart is in London covering this story. Anna, what are you learning about this leak this morning?
Well, as you say, these leaks are absolutely explosive and highly embarrassing for the British government. Some of them, you have the ambassador outlining what he thinks about the US president himself and the administration. Let me bring you one of those, saying we really don't believe that this administration is going to become substantially more normal, less dysfunctional, less unpredictable, less faction-riven, less diplomatically clumsy and inept. Other memos, they go into more policy areas with a huge range. These go from 2017 right up to the present day. On Iran, for instance, the ambassador calls the administration's policy on Iran incoherent and unlikely to change anytime soon. He actually questions the president's claim that he called off a missile strike on Iran last minute, saying that account doesn't stand up. On the allegations about the president's links with Russia, well, he says the worst cannot be ruled out. And he said that could result in this presidency crashing and burning. Although the ambassador also warns the British government not to underestimate the president's ability to shrug off scandal and controversy, saying Trump may emerge from the flames battered but intact, like Schwarzenegger in the final scenes of The Terminator. Very colourful stuff. Very explosive, very embarrassing for the British government. This is the man that's meant to protect and strengthen the relationship with the United States. And frankly, you know, the British government hasn't denied the accuracy of the memos. They've called them mischievous, and they've said that they support ambassadors' ability to be honest, be candid, and they say that simply they don't always reflect the views of ministers and the government. No news yet, of course, from the White House or from the president. All eyes on his Twitter page this morning to see if we can see any more of the fallout.
All right, Anna Stewart for us there in London. We'll see what this means for Sir Derrick's future here in the U.S. CNN reached out to the White